So because of that, because of the scholarly attention of Islam, it just so happens that we have a wealth of material, much more in Islam than on other planes of identity. And so I wanted to talk about Islam here only as a template for how individuals and groups in a place like the Middle East actually think about themselves. Now, the main argument that I have presented before, and I'd like to reiterate again today, I think, is that the modern states in the Middle East, in general, are not good repositories of the identities that the people of the Middle East have historically had. And all of these states, therefore, can be regarded as failures in the sense that they have not been able to absorb or unto themselves the way by which people actually thought about the collective identity. And perhaps that is one of the grounds for the revolutions that we have seen in the Arab world. That is the demand for citizenship, the demand for a kind of state that actually speaks credibly as the voice of the people, which has not happened yet. Now, when the modern Middle East began to emerge, the modern Middle East is really a product of the World War I. That is the war that gives us the Middle East as we have it now. And it is really a war that was waged by powers that largely resided outside of the Middle East. And the victorious parties in that war were definitely countries that were far removed from the realities of the Middle East. England and France in particular. And these are the two countries that, in fact, put the modern Middle East together. Very much, and it's still in that form, in its basic form, as basically that was put together by these two powers. Now, before that period, the only way the Middle East has actually functioned reasonably well was when it acted as an environment of free movement, where borders did not really mean much, where you did have political authorities here and there, but for the most part, civic life was organized outside of the state altogether. Civic life basically was organized around all kinds of groups. Tribes were important. Sufi orders were important. Merchant guilds were important. Networks of urban notable families were important, and so on. And those systems of belonging were porous in the sense that the reality was, one can say that the basic principle was the principle of multiple loyalties. You could be, if you were, for example, if you belong to a tribe, that did not mean that was the only thing that made sense to you. It could mean that it did not preclude the fact that you could have an equally strong loyalty to a global Sufi religious order, for example, or to a professional guild, or to some other network of families, or even to political parties, because those two are beginning to emerge at that point. So the principle of multiple loyalties historically was the kind by which communal life was organized in the Middle East. It was not a region that was organized around the states. The states did not do much for anybody. And the longest lasting states, like the Ottoman Empire, which lasted for 6 centuries, lasted for that long, precisely because it did not do anything. That is how you survive. This is the secret for longevity. The Ottoman Empire was a system that essentially survived by respecting localism. And the idea of that system was that each community was allowed to govern itself according to its own laws. Some provinces were even allowed to mint their own currency. the only thing that the empire cared about was that taxes are paid on time and that there's no rebellion. And if you did both things, one thing and not the other, so you paid your taxes and you did not foment rebellion, you were left alone, pretty much. And that's basically was the secret of survival. Namely, although it was an empire, but within it there was a great deal of autonomy to call for. So it was a very kind of multiple systems that allowed the free circulation of people and of elites as well. And it was a region of traffic. Historically, most wealth in the Middle East was generated by commerce, long-distance commerce. So the merchant communities were a very important source for generating wealth. And those communities were responsible for forging together global society because they were very well connected to the world system. Commercials typically had agents in various countries. There were regular caravans between cities that had predictable cycles that were organized collectively. The idea of the company is, in fact, an old medieval Islamic tradition. The idea, namely, of organizing the company as a vehicle by which you pool risk, so as to enable yourself to carry out global enterprises that otherwise were too risky for an individual to undertake by himself. So caravans basically was part of it, right? The global missions, trade missions were also very important. And also, religious life was organized globally, religious and educational life, which I mean, in the sense that the civil society was essentially kind of informed by the scholars. The authorities that defined Islam historically were not the governments. Islam was historically elaborated by the scholars of religion. And those were individuals, typically men, who tended to be independent economically. They tended to be individuals who kind of were supported through what we call waqf, which is endowment. And endowments, those waqf institutions were very important in Islamic history, much more important than we think of. Often today people don't know what the word waqf means, but historically, Algeria, for example, in the 19th century, by the time the French came, about half of the land was held in waqf endowment. In Egypt, it was almost a third.
Can you raise your voice just a little bit? You're having.
Okay, sorry. And waqf essentially was any property generating any asset that could generate income on a regular basis. It tended to be a piece of land that you designate for charitable purposes into perpetuity, and then you designate how the income from that land was supposed to be used. For example, it could be used to sustain a library or a school or a mosque or a hospital or something like that. Much, in fact, there are some studies that show how much of life, civic life, was supported by those waqf endowments. Some argue that almost the entirety of the educational and health function of the Ottoman Empire was supported by waqf endowment. Al-Azhar University, this prestigious kind of institution up until Nasser in 1961, was entirely supported by waqf endowment. So we're talking about, and the reason I'm talking about that is because I wanted to kind of stress the sources of autonomy of society in Islamic history. That society really generated its own leadership, and it was not governed by the state. It was governed by itself. This is actually very important to keep in mind when we talk about world history in terms of history of empires and states. Because these were superstructures that sat on top and had their own plans and religions of the world, but everyday life was organized differently, according to different authorities. And the authorities that mattered to most people were authorities that were close to them. So that meant that the identities that mattered to people were both cosmopolitan identities and also very local identities, in the sense that Islam was important not as a global identity, not because it had the same meaning, but precisely because it did not have the same meaning. That all kinds of varieties of authorities were able to define it according to local needs. But there was no central authority like the Vatican who could determine what Islam was for all Muslims. We never had that. And even among the Shia, who had a more hierarchical structure, that was not the case. And this time I can talk more about that. But what Islam did is that gave a lot of individuals a sense of global citizenship. So it was not just a religion, really, although it is, of course, a religion in some sense, but more importantly than that, it was a namesake for organizing a global society. The sense that there is this Ibn Battuta, the famous traveler in Islamic history, could be trained as a judge in Tangier, in today's Morocco, and then traveled to India and worked for 8 years as a judge without any further training. And everywhere he went, he felt as an equal citizen in that large Darul of Islam. So one thing that Islam did is not really, in fact, introduce orthodoxy, quite the opposite. It basically allowed people to communicate. It acted as a discourse with a great deal of flexibility, but gave a large number of individuals a sense of global equality, that they could actually speak to each other on the same terms. Some historians, like Marshall Hudson, argue that we should really speak about the Islamic world rather than the Islamic world, by which he meant that Jews and Christians and non-Muslims were also part of that world, and they were culturally Muslims, even though religiously they were obviously not Muslims, but in fact they communicated with everyone according to the same rules, and they understood themselves as part of the Islamic civilization. And now, when you come to my period, there are two things happen that have nothing to do with that historical reality. One of them is the construction of modern states. All of them were built by foreign powers, and not by the people of the region: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, you name it. Or at least were sustained and made possible by the support of foreign powers, like Saudi Arabia. But those were not really indigenous processes for the most part. But that is all we have. That's what we ended up with. The main frames of identity at that front were Arabism and Islam. Two ways of thinking about identity that did not correspond really to these things. Islam continued to be important because of its kind of historical kind of gravitas and kind of apparent kind of relationship to the structure of everyday life. Arabism was kind of, although the term is old, but was beginning to be used as kind of a way to refer to a sense of nationalism that appeared to be more similar to European nationalism. A secular kind of community, right? But larger than the states that were being kind of allowed to exist by European powers. Right? And Arabism basically imagined also to maintain a sense of connectedness across the world, their world, and also the truth signified kind of a rejection of external domination. At the beginning, it was Ottoman domination, but then later it was, more importantly, it was French and British, and in some cases, like Libya, Italian domination. And we connect the whole world together. Now, today, we tend to think of Islam and Arabism as two different ways of thinking about identity, but at the beginning, the first salvos, the first ways of thinking about those identities did not really see a contradiction. In fact, the intellectuals who first formulated Arabism saw Islam and Arabism not to be contradictory at all. And they were kind of really continuing to think in the customary way. That's namely this idea of multiple loyalties. You can define yourself as an individual or even as a community in more than one way. Right? And you don't have to pick one against the other. later on, you will begin to see people who argue that you have to pick one or the other. When the Maoist states emerged, they tried to, at least the elites, tried to acquiesce to that reality, because many people believe in it, by kind of regarding their own states as part of something larger that they aspired to. So, for example, the Egyptian constitution that passed 2012, and that was annulled, and then replaced by the 2015 constitution, both of them, in fact, say the same thing. Namely that Egypt is part of the Islamic world and part of the Arab world, and its mission is to rebuild some sort of Arab unity. It is part of something larger. It is not just itself, even though it is sovereign, but ultimately it belongs to a larger kind of world. And you see that this kind of orientation, at least at the official level, in other documents throughout the Arab world, where you have political elites that do, in fact, express kind of that ultimately their goal is to arrive at a sense of Arab unity, at least. Even though in practice they may be doing the opposite, but at least they seem to have a kind of a lip service to that. Palestine becomes important for that reason, because Palestine is not just the cause of the Palestinians, even though for outsiders it may appear to be so, but it is in fact a global agony to a very large number of people around the world. For the Arabs, because they saw Palestine as Arab, and they saw Palestinians as part of the Arab nation, and they saw what happened in Palestine as a continuation of Western colonialism over Arab lands, and that is why Palestine is not just Palestine. The cause of Palestine goes far beyond Palestine. For Muslims, likewise, it is important because Palestine is regarded as Muslim and defined otherwise. For non-Muslims globally, Palestine is also important for a different reason, because it is part of the global history of colonialism and is seen basically what happened to it is to be seen as part of the unsettled legacy of colonialism. And that is why when John Kerry tries to mediate the conflict and fails, it is because he is really playing a game that either he does not understand or does not want to understand, because he is treating it as a very local problem, which in fact it has never been. And that is why you had wars over Palestine that were fought by non-Palestinians. And that's why it continues to be, even though you may have Arab states that really practically do not want to do anything about Palestine, or do not have the will to do anything about Palestine, we do have Arab public opinion that is inspired by Palestine. So when you see a large kind of universe of public sentiments converging on a problem that is not happening in their own village, you will say again sense that there is a common identity, a sense of kind of investment in other people's problems. So there is, and also Arab Spring itself is an example of the existence of the pan-Arab identity. That is, Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen and Bahrain are very different countries. If you look at the economic indicators, Bahrain is a wealthy country. Yemen is a very poor country. Tunisia was doing well, relatively speaking, before the revolution. Egypt was doing much worse. Libya was doing relatively okay, in fact. But these, in spite of the differences in the local circumstances, you had the revolution at the same time in all of them. Right? And that, the spread of the revolution was an indication of the existence of a sense of a common experience. That is, in fact, one of the things that you see in the early days of the Arab uprising is a repetition of the slogans. The slogan in Yemen, the protesters will repeat the same slogans that they had heard in Cairo. In Cairo, I was there on the first day of the revolution, and Tahrir Square, And the first thing the protesters did after they took over Tahrir Square was they planted the Tunisian flag, not the Egyptian flag, but the Tunisian flag at the center of Tahrir Square, because they saw the Tunisian revolution as their inspiration. So one thing that began to happen in 2011 is a reawakening, right, at the level, of course, of the Arab public, right? A sense of commonality, of purpose, and also a sense that their regimes themselves were becoming similar to each other. Right? They rule the same way. They're all authoritarians. They're all becoming dynastic in the same way. The president ruled for life and then followed by the son and so on. So structurally, the regimes were similar, which created the sense that if one of them falls, then perhaps all of them could fall. Right? So the most important common factor of the Arab uprising is the power example. Not the economic conditions, which varies a lot, but the sense that we were all in the same mess. We were all facing the same kind of systems, which meant that those systems were equally vulnerable, and also the publics imagined themselves to be kind of similar in terms of how they stood vis-a-vis the state. And this is, I'm mentioning that just another example of the existence of a region, right? In the sense that even though there are countries there, right, and separate governments, but we may be going back to some historical pattern, right, where basically the region acts best when it functions as a region. Right? When you don't have borders and states, right? When you don't have actually too much fanatic kind of insistence of disavowing each other. And doesn't work very well when you have a strong sense of borders. The other thing that Arabs look to often these days is Europe. That is, Europe, just across the Mediterranean, is uniting, right? And that is an impressive historical experience. So why couldn't we? Europeans speak, I don't know how many languages now. But at least 27 languages in the European Union, right? Where the Arabs speak one language. The Europeans don't have a sense of common history. In fact, they have a sense of killing each other in large numbers, right? And world wars. Right? So you had historically a lot of people who did not get along at all with each other. Right? And now, of course, all of a sudden, they imagine themselves as belonging to the same European civilization. In fact, I'm going to talk about it. Whereas Arabs have a sense of shared history and shared culture, a lot of it is imaginary, but that's the imagination they have. So why can't we do that when, in fact, people who are a lot more different from ourselves have already been doing, and they are just across the Mediterranean from us. I think I don't want to take too much time, but what I want to say ultimately is that when we talk about identity, we're not talking about really a fixed things in stone. We're talking about a very practical kind of people have reservoirs of identity, and they pick and choose whatever works for them, and having some sort of strong identity in a village does not mean that you could not have a more cosmopolitan kind of sense of identity. The one thing that's new right now is that more demands are being kind of put upon the state from below. The modern states have become just too, unlike the Ottoman Empire, for example, the Egyptian state or the Iraqi state or the Syrian state have become very strong. Partially because either they have a historical accident like oil revenues made them very strong vis-a-vis society, or because foreign support made them strong, or because of the legacy of local wars that also created a reality whereby the government is a lot stronger vis-a-vis its own societies than it used to be. And all that is new. This idea of strong state, except it is not the strong state that is doing anything useful for the people. In fact, it's doing quite the opposite. And it has been acting as a predatory kind of institution upon society. Right? And that is when you hit the age of revolutions in this region, which is obviously going to be a long process. Right? It's not over. Revolutions unleash all kinds of social potential, that percolates for years to come and involves setbacks as well. But you have but we're in the middle of it, right? We're in the middle of a very exciting, I think, period that will include depressing moments, will include setbacks, will include counter revolutions. But that's what revolutions do. They don't begin and end on a particular day. They may appear to take short time at the beginning, but they end up taking 10 years, 20 years, 100 years. I don't know. Okay, I'll stop here and just be happy to hear from you about anything I said or anything else that you've got in your mind.
I was going to ask about, I thought it was really interesting to tie in the European Union, or just mentioning that as an example of what Arabs across the Arab world could see potentially as an example in the future. Just wondering how you could talk about the different, or just like the Shiite, Sunnis, and Sufi dynamics, and like with Iran, and with just how that would all work out, just like the local and more regional system, how that would work.
Yeah, well,
Speak up,
okay.
please. We're getting texts that it's a little hard for them to hear.
Actually, the sound is
Their sound.
muted. They're muted.
So we don't hear their background noise.
okay.
So they hear it better. So if we can ask just everyone in the room just to kind of speak up,
Yeah.
so our participants can hear
So there's a lot of tension in, regarding that subject, with the different Muslim sects, and how would that possibly hinder the progress of becoming more of a regional state like the European Union?
Yeah, that's. I think that's a good question. There's a lot of talk about that. But again, I mean, these identities are not set in stone. The idea that the Shia and Sunni are so different from each other is the period in history where that is highlighted, but then that difference goes away and people don't talk about, and then it comes back. So you have to look at what moment, at what point it is happening. Right now, up until recently, we didn't actually have that much talk about Shiism and Sunnism as being that distinct. I'll give you an example. Hezbollah in Lebanon is a Shia organization. However, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, up until his intervention in the Syrian crisis, was one of the most popular symbols of the Arab world among Sunnis. Because up until then, he did not appear to be fighting any Sunnis. He kind of seemed to be associated. Hezbollah itself also was associated with a national cause. So it has succeeded in liberating southern Lebanon from Israel and was only fighting Israel. So there wasn't really actually here, even though you had the clearly Shia organization, it was very popular across the board. Of course, that changed now because Hezbollah entered into the Syrian conflict on behalf on the side of the regime, and that, of course, gave his opponents, specifically the other kind of Sunni organized group, kind of the ones who actually think that Sunnism should be kind of defined in a very particular way, an opportunity to cast the conflict as a Sunni Shia conflict. There are powers in the region that are sectarian. The most important of which is Saudi Arabia. The Saudi regime has, in fact, been one source of spreading this sectarianism and sectarian identity, right? On purpose, because partially because of ideology, because the Wahhabi clergy, who are the source of authority over Saudi legal religious institutions, do understand Shiism as an enemy, and they have always done that. But that's only Saudi Arabia. The Americans were also part of the problem in a very specific way. When the Americans went into Iraq in 2003, I was living in Washington then, and I was talking to experts. And they were saying things like, Iraq consists of three communities, Sunni, Shia, Kurds. It may be true, but it is not really a point. It really makes no sense if we actually know a little bit more about the country. Right? It is insufficient piece of information. A lot of actors actually acted on that, and then the Americans proceeded to build a sectarian state in Iraq, which, because that is how they imagined Iraq, which made the Iraqi state a sectarian state. Because if you think of the political system, you construct the political system so that you get so many seats because you're Sunni, you get so much this ministry because you're Shia, then people begin to feel that sectarianism is useful to them. It is a way to get benefit, and therefore you reinforce sectarianism. So you create sectarianism because you believe it, and that is what happened in Iraq. The proof that it was not that way is that the Ba'ath Party itself was in fact not historically a Sunni party, even though it was imagined to be. But if you look, for example, at the Ba'ath Party at its origin, back to the 40s and 50s, a lot of its leadership was Shia, or Christians, or even Jews, because you had a large Jewish community in Iraq as well. So you had actually a national party that was, but it just so happened that Sunnis tended to be a lot more represented in the, not just in the party itself, but actually among the bureaucracy, for various reasons. But political parties in Islamic, in Iraqi history, were not sectarian. They became so, of course, later on when you created the sectarian community by planning. And also, even though these communities existed, there was a lot of intermarriage, for example, among them, which is a reality that you miss completely if you imagine that countries in this community. So you don't look at the rates of intermarriage as being important. Also, geography may not be as important as you think of, because even though the north tends to be Kurdish, but Baghdad is a very heavily Kurdish city. The south, a lot of Shia are in the south, but also there are a lot of Shia in Baghdad itself as well. So geographically, these communities are not really as separate from each other as we tended to think of them. So what I'm saying is that sectarianism is something that is actively produced by policies. It is not something that naturally exists.
There are a couple of things you said, and I'm trying to keep up. I'm hoping not to forget the 5 or 6 ideas. What you said about what happened in Iraq, it reminds me like they applied the Lebanese situation, that you have people who are ethnographers of sorts, and they try to broker what appears to be conflicts by identifying the conflicts and identifying groups and giving them shares of political power, and thus they perpetuate, like in a political party, it perpetuates itself because that identity is more important. You were saying like in period of like Ottoman rule, those things weren't so important.
They were important up to a certain point, but so much of life relied on other connectivities, so they were not dominant. And being a member of a sect does not mean that is the only thing that matters to you. When everything depends on it, then it becomes important. Lebanon is a good example, in fact, because Lebanon was built by the French as a sectarian country, specifically. And it was built in such a way that the French imagined that they wanted a Christian majority country in the Middle East, but they wanted to be viable, so they were big enough that included other communities as well. And then you ended up with a system of politics that is sectarian until today. The parliament is divided according to sects. Who is the president, or who's the prime minister, who's speaker of parliament, who is the vice speaker of the parliament, who is the head of the military, who is like the minister of this and that. All that is defined according to sect. And the Lebanese civil war that began in 1975, one reason for it was because there were a lot of people who were disgruntled with sectarianism and wanted to build a new system. But there were other forces that were benefiting from the system as it existed, and so they still have. But the interesting thing is that since its founding as an independent country in 1943, all elites in Lebanon have said publicly that this sectarian or confessional, that's what they call it, confessional system, is temporary. Right? It's not the system they want. Right? That it is temporary until we find some other system, some better system. Right? When the Taif Agreement was signed that ended the civil war in 1990, also the same thing was said, that, okay, we are rebuilding a confessional system for a time being, just for the purpose of peace for now. But our long-term goal is to get rid of it and to establish a non-sectarian kind of society. So officially, actually nobody wants a system because the idea is that it's not kosher or not modern. But practically, because so many political forces benefit from this arrangement, you have until today.
And let's follow up on that too, with the Ottoman rule ending and the end of the caliphate. What was the impact? What do you see the impact of that? I mean, you hear a lot about, was it 1923, the end of the caliphate? I mean, did that have the aspect? Did that create a heightened sense of Islamic identity because feeling as if they'd lost a tradition that goes back to?
Yeah, there was a lot of creativity that you see after the dissolution of the caliphate, because for some Muslims, that was a crisis. Obviously, you had no caliphate, then you had to reintroduce it somehow. And one thing that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt were accused of was that they were trying to restore the caliphate, which in fact they do. In a way, that's part of their official kind of program. But they did not define what that means actually, because that was a very long-term kind of a project. But you had other ideas, all kinds of ideas that were procreating back then about what does that mean. So, for example, some people argued, like Mohammed Bamyeh, who was writing in Muslim India at that point, said, fine, who cares about the caliph as a person? If the caliphate is an Islamic principle, then, and if all the caliphate means is the entrusting of society to kind of its own to some kind of collective mission that's represented by a person. Maybe an elected parliament today could function like a caliph. So the caliph may not necessarily be a person. It could be a parliament, any institution that seems to represent the collective will of the community. So there were, so the reason I'm mentioning that is because I don't think ideas or concepts really determine how we think of them. If we need to, we can change the way we think about the concept, right? Like in this case, a caliphate, and democratize it and make it part of our modern experience, right? As opposed to be prisoners of the traditional old-fashioned way of thinking about, which no longer fits the reality that we have.
Last week, Dr. Sabo, how do you say his last name? Sabo. One of his arguments was that the imperial powers were not completely responsible for what happened. He was specifically speaking about Jordan, but he was talking about internal factors with, such as the Ottoman Empire and Israeli settlers. And you're talking a lot about sectarianism being formed by policies that I'm hearing a lot of policies of imperial powers, and I'm thinking of a lot of other places around the world where that's happened. And I'm just wondering where you see that balance of the, he had talked about these Circassians and different sectarianism being flamed a little bit in policies that were internal, but what kind of balance do you see between external and internal?
Well, it depends on where you draw the boundaries between the two. Right? Some people argue now that you have a war in Syria because Syria is not, what happened in Syria is not dependent on what happened within Syria. The country is very porous, right? And you have all these people coming in, but also the support coming in from all over. Right? The Lebanese civil war, likewise. It was not just happening in Lebanon, it was a regional war. Right? Each country in the region had its own militia and in terms of support and funding. And you had a vicious cycle. So some argue that in reality, the region function as a region. And because of that, it's not as easy to think of internal and external in traditional state-centered kind of ways. It's not everyone's life depends on what happens somewhere else. And so you can't leave that somewhere else. If you want the Circassians, for example, and just a community, are a historical example of people who come in and become part of the society. They maintain their own communities, but they are Jordanians. They are Jordanians in Jordan. They are also part. They are part of the middle class, part of the elite, part of all classes. They are not kind of. They are distinct because they came from a particular part of the world around the same time, and so you have that sense of community. But they are not. But they're not outsiders to the society. They speak Arabic. They intermarry with locals. They look slightly different. Other than that, it's, so it's not the Jewish settlement in Palestine was different from the historical pattern, where you come not as a community and you mix with the locals, but you can come in and claim that this being your land exclusively, and kick everybody else out. This is not the historical pattern. You had a lot of newcomers always, but it's not. But you never had an experience like, of course, this settlement activity, where you have kind of exclusive nationalism that results from.
Can you talk? I didn't realize that Jordan was such a new nation state. And can you talk about if there's a tension, when we go to Jordan, will we get a sense of tensions between I'm a Jordanian versus he's a Palestinian, and how does that surface in society? In a Jordanian context.
It depends on who you talk to. Sometimes this may be more of a problem other times. Since 1970, where we had a civil war in Jordan, the Bureau was there. There was a sense of difference after the wars. because the regime has understood its own base of support consists of the Jordanian side, who are the minority of the population. But a lot of the Palestinians are also part of the elite. Right? So it's not as though they are outside the system altogether. They may have fewer structured opportunities in the sense that fewer of them are ministers in the cabinet, in proportion to their members, or members of the parliament in proportion to their member. And that's true. But in more recent years, especially in 2007, around the time of the Arab Spring, most protests against the regime were done by Jordanians. And the Jordanians themselves, especially in the south, were in fact rebelling against the regime. Right? And so the regime was not sure what to do. I don't think the regime itself has any long-term policy, right, to favor any particular community. It just tries to play different communities against each other so that it can remain in place. And that may have to do something with the fact that Jordan itself is a very new and in fact even accidental country. The only reason Jordan is where it is because Abdullah was, after World War I, was coming from Hijaz, from Mecca, to help his brother Faisal, who had installed himself as a king of Syria. There was no Jordan. Syria was an interesting place. And then the French, because according to the arrangement between the French and the British, Syria was supposed to go to the French. The French did not want a king, so they kicked him out of Damascus, and Abdullah came to help him, because Abdullah himself wanted to be Damascus too. And then Churchill intervened at that point and met Abdullah halfway in what is now Jordan, and said to him, "Don't go any further. The French are our friends. We may deal with them. But we'll make it happy for you here. We will create a kingdom for you." That was an emirate, not a kingdom yet. As a compromise, and move your brother Faisal to Iran, to Baghdad, make him a king there. So kings could be moved like that. They were not tied to any place, you could just move there. So you have Jordan, or Transjordan, I was called them, emerging by complete accident. Not by any plan. The Sykes-Picot agreement that was between the French and the British that was supposed to divide the Middle East after World War I did not include Jordan. There was no plan for it. Right? So just a necessity. And that created the problem for Abdullah, because Transjordan was sparsely populated and a very poor territory. So did not really have the real basis for being a kingdom. So one thing he thought that he could do is make it into a viable kingdom by making a deal with the Zionist movement in Palestine at that point, and divide up Palestine between himself and the Zionist state. That was kind of the plan. And that was indeed the outcome of the 1948 war, where in fact the West Bank, which is what had remained of all Palestine, was annexed to Jordan and became part of Jordan, part of this new kingdom that otherwise was resourceless. And the West Bank was at that point contained the majority of the population of Jordan. And the population of the West Bank was doing Jordanian citizenship. So part of the newness and the kind of, in fact, meaninglessness of Jordan as a country, sometimes leads efforts to actually make the country a lot more meaningful or viable by making all kinds of deals with the outside powers, as indeed happened in 1940, where you had the first beginning of a viable kingdom. But again, the king, Abdullah and his descendants also had to make all kinds of deals with this population that they themselves did not know, because they were outsiders, in fact, to and the family came from Western Arabia. it's not really rooted and neither was his brother when he became the king of Iran. But the thing is that none of them at that point wanted, like Faisal or Abdullah, none of them wanted the countries that they got. None of them actually wanted Syria or Jordan or Iraq. All of them, in fact, were committed, at least officially, to the goals of the Arab rebellion against the Ottoman system, which began in 1916, which is to build an independent Arab state in the Mashriq area. So which would have meant Arabia and the Levant, the part of the Arab world that was controlled by the Ottoman system. That was the rebellion. It wasn't to get Iraq. It wasn't to get Jordan. It wasn't to get
You made mention earlier about, that you were talking to multiple loyalties early on and how things changed when we got to more modern times. And with the Arab Spring and everything, there's been sort of a return to some of this original idea of multiple loyalties identifiers.
The Arab Spring is a complex system. I think it's not, and you have to look at the kind of language that people use when they put this. The common term that you see across the Arab uprising is the building of a civic state. And that is the goal, wherever the revolution succeeds. By which typically is meant a state that is accountable to its citizens and where sovereignty belongs to the people. Rather than a state that sits on top of the people. But where you see this, and you don't see people expressing the principle of multiple loyalties charismatic.
Okay.
So normal people may not use it.
Sure.
And they may not know what I'm talking about. But the way they did it is that way. Yemen is a good example, right? Where you have a commitment to Yemen, to Islam, to Arabism, to your tribe, to your village, right? All at the same time. Right? So you have, so what I'm calling multiple loyalty is actually the de facto practice of everyday life. But the goal is, but where you saw, what we see the objective, right, of all these rebellion is actually to build a civic state.
That's was my question. So the role of the state is more of a civic one.
Exactly. That is the important thing. And another demographic or other sociological reality that's interesting about the Arab Spring is the learning, the cross-learning that is happening. Right? That means that people learn from each other how to do rebellion. And so there's migrating consciousness. That's part of the phenomenon.
What's the role of the al-waqt? Yeah, what's the present day role of that now? Is it diminished or is it still?
It's not. Political parties in Egypt are not very strongly rooted. The Muslim Brotherhood was the only exception. It was the only party that did have a real base in society. Al-Waqt is an old party, in theory, of course, because it came after the 1919 revolution in Egypt. And for about 20 to 30 years, it was really the party of Egyptian nationalism. Every time we had elections, fair and free elections after 1919, it won by a landslide, big time. It was the party of Egypt. But then Nasser came, and it was banned. It also had lost popularity at that time because it had not accomplished its goals. It had not freed Egypt from British domination, which had been its goal, and was making all kinds of compromises with the monarchy. And it also became corrupt. So it was also losing. So by the time Nasser banned all political parties, including the Waqt, nobody cared at that point about it. It came back later when Sadat allowed parties to come again, but it was not the same old party. It was a new thing, a new outfit that had picked up the old name. It is still, basically, at least in ideology, the party of the old Egyptian liberalism. But there are other liberal parties now, so it's not the only game in town. And the problem with Egypt is that up until now, you had the two tendencies that people talk about then, the Islamist and the liberal. The one problem with the liberal tendency is that you have 90 different political parties. All of them say the same thing, when you should actually have just one. But that is the kind of thing that you would see later happening if you had a real, meaningful political process and elections where all of them enter it, and then a lot of the parties get decimated and converge. But we have not had that process yet. That actually that makes the liberal forces actually emerge with a real kind of voice that is unified. It has not happened.
But what about the tradition of this, like having the endowments for funding libraries? And
yeah, those have been destroyed by the monasteries. The Nasser and Regime Foreign even have been chipping away at the endowments and private and nationalizing them.
What's that called? Because I think I confused that with WAF, which is, you're saying, a political party.
A WAF.
Yeah.
Yeah. The WAF, and I thought the WAF party.
Spell it in Arabic.
WAF party is WAFD.
WAFD, okay.
WAF is WQ, and that is endowment.
Oh, because that's what I was
I think
thinking.
it's what you meant.
Okay.
Islamic endowment.
Which one is the endowment, Islamic endowment?
The one of the Q.
Okay, yeah, so that's what I meant, the WAF.
Yeah.
Al-Waqf.
And it is one of the first.
Yeah.
Well,
One of the first items, in fact, to be historically codified in the Islamic Sharia. Rules and how it's supposed to work.
But it's completely died.
You still have WAF institutions until today, but they're not nowhere near what they used to be historically. Right? Where you have, depending where you look, from 1/3 to 1/2 of the land held up in these endowments. Now, they still exist, but you don't have any. My family, from my mother's side, has a saint in it, a local saint, who has a WAF. That's next to the shrine, and then your rent from that land is supposed to go to the upkeep of his shrine. But like so many WAFs, the land had been the parcel that was sold, part of it being taken up by the government and so on. So it's so these have actually these institutions have the monastic has introduced upon society. That's another thing that they intruded on, because the WAF had been one of the sources of independence, societal state. Colonial powers have done it as well. And the first that the French do when they conquer Algeria in the 1830s is to try to control the local endowments, because they were vast. They were more than half the land, and they became a source of support for the rebellion against them. So colonial power, but also post-colonial states, right? All of them wanted to actually chip away at this institution.
Is there public interest now amongst the Arabs to bring back WAF, or is that just...
Those who have an Islamic inclination have been talking about that, but not others.
Really?
There are others who think that who say that the functions that the WAF have fulfilled historically now are the functions of a modern, responsible, accountable state, elected by the people, has more resources, stuff like that, or NGOs. This is another factor that have entered the equation. The idea of the WAF continues to be important for those who think and have an Islamic reference point. So they refer to that. And it's also historically important. So if you want to analyze Islamic history, we have to talk about it.
Can you talk about how, I mean, when John and I were over in Egypt, you know, the second conversation you'd have with somebody would eventually bring up the Palestinians.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But now, you know, since the Brotherhood came in and using the Palestinians almost as a threat or as if we help them, and can you talk about that? Because while we say, you know, this larger Arab, but yet it almost seems like that Brotherhood is disappearing by, maybe they're being manipulated, I don't know, but.
No, the official discourse in Egypt is against Hamas, not the Palestinians.
Because it's Brotherhood.
So Hamas, in particular, because Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is a global organization. That's historically has maybe 70 to 100 branches around the world. But these are independent from each other, and the branches are not really, they don't have unified command. In fact, the idea is that has always been that each national branch has its own funding, financially and politically is independent, determines on its own what tactics to use that are adequate to the local situation. And so you have different branches. They're not always called the Brotherhood. For example, we have Hamas. In Tunisia, it's called Al-Nahda. In Jordan, it's called something else. So it's not always they don't always even use it in the name Brotherhood, but they all understand it as part of this global.
But so you're just saying the current Sisi administration was afraid of Hamas, right? Because they're part of the Brotherhood. So, but do you feel like the Egyptians themselves still care as much, or are they more introspective, thinking of their own survival?
Well, they have a lot of problems right now, of course, but they have not. I mean, nothing has happened to take Palestine off of the table.
Right.
But for most Egyptians, Israel continues to be an enemy, even though you have a peace treaty. But nothing has happened to make Israel look less of an enemy than it used to be. Israel is why you have an Egyptian army to begin with, right? And you have always had a cold peace, right, with Israel. Right? And if you look at the acrimonies in Egypt right now between the Brotherhood and their opponents, both of them have accused the other of working with the Israelis. The opponents of the Brotherhood said that the Brotherhood are working with the Israelis. The Brotherhood said that those who oppose them are working with the Israelis and the Americans. So you can tell by the language that people use what's how they think.
Well, that was something I saw, though. I mean, anything that was wrong was a Zionist conspiracy. That's what we saw when I was in Alexandria. I don't know if you remember Crazy Khaled. We call him Eggplant. He was just crazy. We were at the restaurant, and I was asking him, talking about Shia Islam, and he said, "Oh, that's a Zionist conspiracy." He said Shia Islam was a Zionist conspiracy, and he was talking about Lyndon LaRouche, the one American who really knows how things work, you know. And I'm just kind of like Lyndon LaRouche, and then I had to kind of digest it all, but. It seems like that's like an important, straw man in some ways. Maybe Zionism is a catch-all for an awful lot of, for me to have identity and for me to have power as a group, I have to be able to paint somebody as an out-group. I have to target. And, it's almost Zionism needs to be there as a validating point for a government. It provides them something, a target, something to hate.
Yeah, I mean, it's useful. have an enemy sometimes because you have a source something behind all that you're, and that's I think more true for institutional powers like governments in particular. But I do have one thing to say about conspiracy theories, which are in fact common throughout the Middle East. I'm one of those people who think that conspiracy theories get a bad rap.
It's a conspiracy.
Some of them are true. But I'm interested in them not because they're true or false, but because sociologically speaking, I think they tend to become more important for people who feel that they do not control their own destiny, and that they feel that they're too weak, as a person or as a collectively, to control their affairs, and they see things happening to them all the time, and that they can't do anything about it. And those are the environment which you see actually conspiracy theories percolate. So we can all say, oh, they're bad, they are really horrible, that people think that way, which is true. But also there's a context that produces this tendency to think in a conspiratorial way about the world.
Can you talk about how the kingdom, how the Hashemite family keeps control in Jordan, and how have they been able to sustain themselves and actually survive the Arab Spring around them? Is it because of the dividing the groups, as you mentioned before?
Well, they do. They tax exchange, and that is the secret. Is that they do. They're flexible, so they don't always use the same method. Sometimes they use pure repression. Like in the 70s, for example, that was a very dark period where the Mukhabarat, secret police, controlled everything. Everything was clamped up on in that event. But then before that and after that, you have periods of selective openness. You have parties being allowed, the press being given relative freedom, elections. And then you have manipulation of elections, and then more free elections. So the way the regime has been controlling society is not by following any consistent policy, but rather by figuring out what is suitable for this particular moment. Right? And nothing is long term. So if it opens up and democratizes for now, it doesn't mean that that's what it's going to do next year. If it crushes everyone today, it doesn't not mean that was going to do tomorrow. Sometimes it opens up for the sole cynical reason, finding out who the opposition is, so that they figure out who to put in jail. So there is selectiveness and kind of malleability that has been part of this legacy. Also, its ability to introduce uncertainty about the alternative is important, and that is important, especially in countries that have seen civil strife, like Jordan. That we don't know what the alternative is going to be, so we just stick with the situation that we have right now. The fact that it's monarchy gives it an added buffer because monarchs are able to blame someone else, and that is in fact what we see in Jordan. One thing you see in Jordan is a very frequent change of government. Prime ministers are appointed and dismissed sometimes within a month. So it is able to, but the king remains. But he is able, because he is a king, to blame someone else. And as you have this political elite that exists only for the purpose of being blamed. And that's their role. And they come and go in and out of government all the time. That's so that's kind of one of the specific kind of attributes that a monarchy kind of can play. The other thing that seems to actually complicate the picture a lot too is that Jordan is often a country of migrants. So you have a Palestinian presence that is very significant and looks permanent. Then in the 10 years ago, you had a very large Iraqi migration. That's where you have 400, 500,000 Iraqis. Very large influx. Now we have Syrians, 600 to 700,000 Syrians in the country. And it is a relatively resourceless country that has been able to absorb very large number of people, even though it has very little water, very little ability to actually accommodate them. But that influx of new populations always have kind of sometimes helped life in ways that are unexpected. For example, around the Kuwait War in 1990, you had about 1 million Palestinians working out of Kuwait and in Jordan. And a lot of those happened to be kind of middle-class entrepreneurial people who came with some capital and actually helped the economy in the long run. So there are many things, and you will see also that there's a big enough middle class, and also some upper class that has a vested interest keeping things as they are. But no, I think can change.
Do the Iraqi refugees, do they have any say in the government at all? Or the Palestinians, at what point, how long do you have to live there to become a citizen?
The Palestinians became citizens because that was a policy of the government to make them into Jordanians so that the country becomes viable. But that was not applied to the Iraqis or to the Syrians. The Iraqis went back eventually. The Syrians not yet, but they're expected to go back eventually. They're not expected to be there permanently.
Yes. Other questions?
I guess a very practical one, and since sociologists are typically practical, we're going to be going to Jordan, obviously. What are some things you think we should look for in terms of, what are some things we should look for in culture? What are some identifiers or some things we should kind of perceive?
I think just talking to people is the most, listening is really the most useful thing you can do. It's as many varied people as possible. And you may hear different narratives, or you hear narratives that converge on the same theme. You may want to talk to activists, perhaps, people who are connected to some think tanks, may be also important people to talk to. But taxi drivers are fun. Very interesting. War people, fascinating. You know so much.
So I was in Egypt, I was too busy praying to talk to the taxi driver.
And Amman has, in particular, they say in Amman, it has changed in ways that I don't like personally. I go there a lot. But it has become more a divided society more than ever. You have West Amman and East Amman that don't have much to do with each other. And the city has developed horizontally. So now we have a traffic problem, whereas historically we did not have. It does have an old historic core that is interesting. But people with money prefer to live far away from it. And to keep on going further and further away.
So can you talk about the division between the East and West? What are the different characteristics and how that came about?
The East is poor Amman. The West is the wealthier part of Amman. It is topographically very distinct because it's built on hills. So each, they're called the mountains. They're steep hills sometimes. And each is its own neighborhood. So there is more so even at Pittsburgh, these topographic realities create a sense of distinct kind of identities. Technically, the palaces are in East Amman, the royalties palaces, but of course they have nothing to do with that area. If you walk around, you'll see East Amman will be the part of Amman that is a lot less used to seeing foreigners. Most of the foreigners go to the West. You are likely to hear a lot of English in West Amman. The noble rich like to speak English, even though not because they have any profound thoughts that they need to express in English, because we think that's looking cool. That means, but most of the time they use to express the stupidest things. They don't really have much to say most of the time. But in terms of intellectual life, unfortunately, Amman does not really have the greatest kind of concentration of intellectual resources in the Middle East. Cities like Beirut or Cairo tend to be more interesting in that regard. Even Damascus. So Amman had tended to be a lot more kind of business oriented, a lot more earthly, a lot more pragmatic. There's an art scene that's small. It's okay, but I don't think it's great. But it's good. Whatever you see is good, but it is really small still. There are some cultural events that happen in what is called the Hussein Hall. There are a lot of things that are called Hussein. In West Amman. So sometimes if you see a poet like Adonis showing up, or some luminaries may show up, they would be worth in fact to see. The University of Jordan may be worth a visit. Maybe also Yarmouk University up in the north as well. And there may be some interesting faculty talk.
Is it dangerous to go to East Amman?
I don't think so. You have to know it, though. It's complicated because the streets are just going up, and I get lost myself. So it's not. I don't think it is. I mean, rate of crime is very small, very low enough in Jordan as a whole. We don't actually have that much crime, even though you have a lot of poverty. I think standing out may kind of make you look weird, and people may talk to you, but I don't think it's dangerous. I think it may be just too unfamiliar, right? People who don't know the neighborhood. And it is the kind of place that even people from the same city, West Amman, don't go to. Right? So it's not because they have nothing to do. It's
like, is it like in Baba in Cairo?
No, not like, it was close, but not exactly. And Baba is a makeshift neighborhood. So it's not, East Amman is kind of older. It's expanding, but it's not. It has some of that attributes of shanty town, but it's not really shanty town. It is a city.
I have
But
a
it's-
question. Oh, sorry.
Hold on, wait.
Can I talk now? Is that okay?
Not yet.
No?
No?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. You might have said this already. I was just curious how East and West got so divided. Was it because the royalty were on the East side? You might have touched on that already. I just didn't have a clear answer on that.
No, I think they got divided because of the way all cities get divided. The wealthy people live in their own neighborhoods, and the poor people live in their own neighborhood, and they have different cultures and different kind of support systems.
It had nothing to do with the royalty on the East side. That wouldn't play a role in it.
Not really, no. I mean the old kind of royal palace happened to be slightly in the east because that is where the highest parts of Amman used to be, right? And that is also where the old Ottoman citadel sits, right? And that is also, by the way, where the Romans kind of had their own kind of encampments. So the east, at least part of it, the part that is close to downtown, tended to be the seat of power just because it was so high, right? Kind of acts an observatory tower. Right? But the wealthier kind of population in Amman wanted areas that they can develop according to their own taste, and a lot more of that land was available toward the west. So that's what they want.
Okay, thank you.
How is it different in terms of culture? You said culturally a little bit different?
Yeah, it's just like here. We have middle-class neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods have different culture.
But I'm sure they don't have the same like poor or the culture of the lower class here, for example. It's like different.
Well, they were different in terms of what language they use, for example. Arabic versus English. What kind of things they talk about. In West Amman, you may hear a lot of conversation about land prices, for example, right? And business, maybe architecture. In East Amman, we'll have different stories. So these stories would not come up. Right? People may be talking about subsidies, for example. They may be talking about the price of meat. They may be talking a lot about their families. Both of them would be talking about marriage arrangements, which is a very big topic, topic for conversation, especially among the women who are in charge of the domestic space and who tend to be responsible for arranging marriages. And they spend a lot of time talking about that. And of course, it includes a lot of gossip. But that's how you get to know who's doing what, right? And whose kids go to what school and so on.
Do they listen to the same music? East and West? Are there different kinds of music they listen to?
Maybe. I don't know enough actually about. I haven't actually paid attention to that. But I'm not sure that there's a very clear difference in the kind of music.
Like in Egypt, it's shabi and
shabi. Yeah, you would have shabi as well. You would have, but even in the East, you may have, hip hop. But it's not. But you may find that in the West as well.
when you're talking about marriage, is there a problem with the man has to provide everything, the apartment, the furnishing, all this, and they can't afford it?
Yeah, that happens.
I mean, I know that was happening in Egypt. It's a real issue.
It happens.
So people are postponing marriage, but yet they get married on the side, these quick marriages, just to have personal, intimate
One of the
relationships.
things that actually Islamic movements kind of capitalized on is that they offered their services to help people get married. So sometimes what they would do is solve this problem by having mass marriages. So get 20 or 40 couples, and they would collect donations and have collective marriage. I mean, not everybody, but actually all. Let's say one wedding, you have 40 weddings at the same time, right? All paid for, right? And various people contributed, and that kind of was a useful service that, of course, gave them political and social capital as well for the movements that were kind of organizing that. So that's and that's in fact one way by which Islamic movements in fact did penetrate society. They offered their services across a whole range of issues that people need help with: marriage, housing, health, and stuff like that.
But didn't that just target the most poor? Because I mean, I would think that would really, I mean, culturally, families would not want that option, and that's a really culturally that's important for families to make that choice and be involved with that. So to hand that over is a huge. That's difficult.
No, you're right. It wasn't all classes, so the wealthier people did not need those services.
Right.
For them, having a lavish wedding was an important kind of representation.
But it had to be a humbling experience for families to participate. Was it a public wedding?
But
wow.
I'm not sure it was humbling. Actually,
No?
It's a question of perspective. You know, cultures change. Cultures are not set in stone. Right? And sometimes you make accommodations because reality needs it.
Were other people in their community doing it? I guess that's also part of it. Is it wasn't just
but
one.
that was the point.
Yeah.
You're not doing it yourself. There were other people who are participating in the rituals, and that gave it more significance and meaning. So it's not
Interesting.
I'm curious about the low crime rate, because several things I've read have talked about Jordan as a very low crime rate. Is that typical of countries in that area, or what kind of factors play into that?
In general, in the Middle East, we have a relatively low crime rate comparatively. And that's surprising given the levels of poverty and deprivation. There's one factor that I think helps is the social solidarity system. That is, a lot of people who are poor are taken care of anyway. One example of that is a place like Gaza, a place that officially has 38% unemployment rate. In reality, in fact, maybe 70%. But the system is such that if there is one person in a whole extended family who is working, nobody goes hungry. Right? And that's not just in the family, that is in the extended. Right? So the system works. Right? You have no unemployment benefits liable by the government. You have no social security. Right? You have no daycare centers. All these are provided by the extended family. So the way the system works is that even in conditions of need and poverty and catastrophe, even, there are a lot of people around you who you can turn to, right, and who will help. And then, of course, in return, you help them, right? Even if you haven't seen them in years. So that's the expectation. So that may be one reason that this is not just crime may be related not just to the existence of poverty, but to the fact that you have no one to go to. And those kind of old, kind of traditional systems of kind of mutual help seem to continue to be working and even to be perhaps even more necessary.
I am interested
Very good.
In the question of poverty. My school district that I work in, my particular building, we're dealing with 80%, over 80% poverty for our student body, and so I've done a lot of the look. So when you talk about how people are going to want to talk to you about different things, what based on where they live, they think about, they care about everything that matters to them. It's like two different worlds. And so when you're talking about the extended family takes care of somebody who is in need, I'm wondering if you see much like generational poverty, like where it's, or if that system kind of, when somebody's in need and when somebody comes in and helps you, then if it builds a sense of now you pay it back kind of thing, is there, I guess, can you speak about, the prevalence of generational poverty?
Yeah, I mean, there is, people talk about that, and there's, that's, it is, in some sense, it may be a problem, because if you are, in theory, responsible to so many people, right? You may not have that much of an opportunity to build up your own capital. And that may somehow perpetuate what we call poverty.
It can kind of work in both ways, right?
Yeah, but what they're supposed to do. I mean, the thing is that you cannot not do it, right? Because then you would be ostracized from the community, right? And you would actually lose your reputation. And that is very important for people. It is a society that is actually based on reputation. And reputation is very important for all social classes. And reputation is the considered by needs. So you always have kind of the obligation to do something for others. And if you lose your reputation, you have nothing. So that is so there's a powerful disincentive to act purely as a self-seeking individual. There are people who lift themselves out of poverty, as though it never happens. But you have to. Everyone expects that they have to fulfill those social obligations, wherever they happen to.
Hey, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi. It's a little in the past now. I feel like we moved on a little bit, but I was just curious. You talked about West Amman and East. What about the relationship between just Amman in general with people outside of the city? The reason I asked, when I was in Ecuador in Quito, there seemed to be a huge, rift between the people in the city and outside. I was wondering if there's anything in general that you feel there.
Amman does not have, unlike many historical cities in the Middle East, does not have hinterlands. That's by which I mean an agricultural area surrounding it that provides it with food. It is in the desert, really. It is not. It wasn't really supposed to be inhabited. But things happen. And when King Abdullah, in fact, when they founded Transjordan for him, he never thought of Amman as the capital. He wanted Salt, which is a city in the northwest of Jordan, which is the agriculturally rich part of Jordan. That is where interesting things were, right? Not Amman. But those people don't want him. Also part of the reason. In any case, he have a man that is established basically in a desert area, but because of demographic growth, it has become connected to other cities. Just because the city itself expanded, like Zarqa to the north. In fact, you would probably, if you travel to Zarqa, which is a different city, now you may have a continuously built up area rather than space between those cities, as used to be the case.
Can you talk about the equivalent of the brotherhood, or not the brotherhood, just is religiosity and the current and the kings, the kingdom, not the kingdom, the Hashemite. What is that like right now? Are there tensions? Are too conservative? They're not conservative? And do they dictate what is said in the mosque? Like Nasser Mubarak took control over what was said in the mosque. How does that work in Jordan, and what is the connection between the clergy and the ruling elite?
Well, that's something you probably should ask some imam about.
Okay.
Because I'm not sure it is as controlled. But there may be new dynamics that I don't know about. People local question.
Okay. Okay. But do they have a history of dictating what is said in the mosque or not?
Not really, no.
Okay.
I'm not that kind of control. And mosques in Jordan, like everywhere else, they're built by all kinds of people. So often what gets said on the mosque is controlled by whomever built it.
I'm just wondering how Jordanians feel about the king. Like, I know, like in Saudi Arabia, like Saudis or at least from my experience, I was that they're really complacent with like the king or honor him a lot just because they just feel very loyal to him. And it's something you never really bring up in conversation. Like, it's kind of controversial. Just wondering how that is in Jordan.
Well, there is still in Jordan the expectation that you are either being watched or that you can't talk about that level of politics with someone that you do not know and be honest about your opinion. So often what you hear may not be the truth, may not be the true opinion, unless there's a level of trust that develops. Outwardly, people will say the official things, what they're expected to say to strangers. But sometimes maybe not, and the person. I mean, this came from what I know is it seems to be that a lot of people are ambivalent about him. That he is someone who is maybe not the worst, but not the best. He is an outsider in some sense. He grew up in England when he was installed as a king. He spoke better English than Arabic. Now he speaks better Arabic, finally. And because of that, his speeches are a little longer. But he seems to be more distant from society than his father. His father used to be able to go to a Bedouin community and sit on the floor like them and eat with his hands. This guy doesn't know how to do it, for example. Some little things like that sometimes have symbolic significance.
What about his wife? Because she seems to really reach out, at least through social media.
Yeah.
She really reaches out as one of the people, but I've heard a lot of rejection of her as one of the people because she's Palestinian.
You hear that sometimes, if I'm really talk to. Some people reject her because her role is not considered to be the proper role for a woman. Right? And she is too much in the public sphere, appears to have too many initiatives, too much power, too much influence, all of which may be not true. Right? But people may object to her for all kinds of reasons. And sometimes people may criticize her because they really want to criticize her husband, but they're not allowed to. So that would be an indirect way to criticize the husband. Who actually a weaker kind of part of the system. It's a common opposition strategy.
Questions? Well, thank you. Thank you.